Good afternoon from Geneva. Good morning to those of you in New York, and thanks for joining us wherever you might be. This is Unidear's webinar on nuclear risks. My name is Wilfred Wan. I'm a researcher with the WMD and other strategic weapons program at Unidear. And I'll be your moderator today, and I'll set the scene as well. In recent years, amidst a downturn in geopolitical relations with the arms control and disarmament structures under pressure and the impact of a number of technological developments, there's been an increased focus on the state of risk of nuclear weapon use. If we look at risk as a function of probability and consequence, probability of use seems to be trending in the wrong direction because of those factors, as well as the continued reliance on nuclear weapons in the security strategies and doctrines of nuclear armed and nuclear allied states, as well as what some would argue are perceptions about the increased usability of nuclear weapons in a wider range of circumstance. I think it's partly for these reasons that nuclear risk reduction has emerged as a priority topic on the international agenda. Risk reduction referring to reducing the risk of any use of nuclear weapons, intentional or inadvertent. Risk reduction activity is seen both as having immediate resonance and also contributing potentially to rebuilding trust and confidence, to encouraging practical cooperation and engagement towards more progress in nuclear arms control and disarmament. And indeed, it's a topic area that has seen some quite constructive dialogue, including in this review cycle of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, a review cycle that has been extended due to COVID. It's also appeared on a number of various state-led initiatives. We've also seen quite a lot of progress in research on the topic of nuclear risk reduction towards the identification and presentation of concrete options for states to consider. And certainly Unidear has been trying to contribute to this conversation, thanks to the support of Australia, Finland, Sweden, and Switzerland, and with the substantive engagement of these and many, many other states and stakeholders. Over the course of our work, we've tried to recast the topic in a fuller and more systematic manner. We've established a framework that identifies different pathways to potential nuclear use. We've engaged in dialogues with stakeholders on possible means forward. And our work is ongoing and will continue in the next few years. Today's events continues these discussions, focusing attention on scenarios of concern. And what we hope to try to do is to capture some of the interactive nature and dynamics of different risk drivers and to see how different pathways of use can manifest in particular situations. We're quite pleased to have an excellent panel of experts today to discuss these topics with us. In terms of the event structure, we've asked each of our panelists to present in about 4 to 5 minutes a scenario of concern, drawing on their areas of expertise and their perceptions of the sources and drivers of nuclear risk. After all of them make their cases, I'll turn it over to my colleague, John Borey, who's acting as a commentator, and he'll identify some common themes across the presentations and scenarios. I'll then lead a moderated discussion, pushing the experts on their scenarios and, of course, on recommendations to address those particular scenarios. And finally, from the audience, I will select and read out a few questions for our panelists to consider. You can submit in written form with the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom application, and you can also provide a thumbs up on each other's questions if there's anything of particular interest or resonates with you. So we've got quite a lot to get through in the next hour and 10 minutes or so. With that, let me quickly introduce all of our panelists before turning it over to them for their presentations. So the first panelist is James Acton, who is the Jessica T. Matthews Chair and co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment. James, as you may know, is quite prolific across all nuclear policy issues. And in fact, he has a webinar, another webinar scheduled later today with Carnegie on the future of New START. His current work looks at escalation risks and the future of arms control. And he's contributed to the Carnegie edited volume recently on entanglement, Chinese and Russian perspectives on non-nuclear weapons and nuclear risks, and the international security article Escalation through Entanglement. Our second panelist is Christine Parthmore, who is the CEO of the Council on Strategic Risks, also the director of the Janney Nolan Center on Strategic Weapons there, and the manager of its climate nuclear security project. Christine has extensive experience in the US Department of Defense across security think tanks and academia. Her issues of interest include countering WMD, arms control and disarmament, and innovation and technology trends. Christine also contributed a few years ago to Unidair's volume on understanding nuclear weapon risk, which is in many ways the genesis of our continuing work on the topic. Our third panelist is Jingdong Yuan, the Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. He's also an Associate Senior Fellow at CPRI. JD specializes in global regional arms control and nonproliferation issues, in Asia-Pacific security, and in Chinese defense and foreign policy. JD was a visiting fellow with Unidair for a few months in 2019, and I'm especially grateful for him joining today, despite it being 11:30 p.m. in Sydney. I should stress that our panelists have been invited to speak in their own capacity. And I should also mention that this session is being recorded and will be shared online in the upcoming weeks. With that, I will turn over to James for your presentation.
Well, good morning, Wilfred, and thank you for inviting me to participate this morning. I think you teed up the subject that I'm going to talk about this morning very nicely. A lot of my research has focused on something that I term the growing entanglement between the nuclear and non-nuclear domains. So during the Cold War, we think of nuclear and non-nuclear weapons as being largely separate. And that's not entirely true, but it's not a bad approximation. Whereas today, those things are interacting in lots of different ways. And we have increasingly advanced non-nuclear weapons that can threaten both nuclear forces and their command and control capabilities. That's one manifestation of entanglement. And the second one is that many of these nuclear command and control capabilities are in fact dual use. They're used to support both nuclear and non-nuclear operations. And when those things are taken together, you get the escalation pathway that I'm going to summarize this morning. So to make this very concrete, in the case of the United States, for example, the US has early warning satellites, which were originally conceived of to detect a large-scale nuclear strike against the United States. But those satellites over time became increasingly capable, and today they're used to support non-nuclear operations as well. So for example, they would be the first US asset probably to detect the launch of non-nuclear ballistic missiles. And then they could cue ballistic missile defenses to try and shoot down those missiles. So the scenario that I want to paint would take place in a conflict between NATO and Russia. And imagine that in this particular scenario, the US and NATO, their ballistic missile defenses in Europe. So not the homeland stuff to defend the United States, but the shorter range regional stuff within Europe, is proving effective at blunting Russian conventional non-nuclear ballistic missile attacks against targets in Europe. Which could have an important effect on the war effort. In that scenario, Russia, in order for its non-nuclear ballistic missiles to be able to penetrate US and NATO defenses, might do something like attack US early warning satellites. And that may be, that's something that Russian experts have said would very much be on the table. And that's an action that, from Russia's perspective in this scenario, would be kind of a tactical action, as I say, exclusively intended to ensure that its missiles could penetrate defenses in Europe. But from a US perspective, that could signal that Russia was planning to use nuclear weapons. The US, rightly or wrongly, believes that Russia has this so-called escalate to de-escalate doctrine, in which Russia would use nuclear weapons early in a conflict that it was losing in order to try to terrify the US and NATO into backing down. and that those might include strikes against the US homeland. And if that was what Russia was considering, then Russia would have various incentives to take out US early warning satellites as a prelude to that strike, including so that homeland missile defenses couldn't shoot down a small Russian nuclear strike. And so from the US perspective, Russia's actions in shooting down early warning satellites may be just something to do with the war in Europe, or they may be preparations to escalate to nuclear use against the United States. And given what the US believes Russian doctrine to be, as I say, rightly or wrongly, I think there's a risk that the US would believe that a nuclear strike was on the way. And in that scenario, the US has been very explicit that from a US perspective, nuclear use would be on the table in that scenario. In the most recent nuclear posture review, the US government says very clearly that nuclear use would be on the table, not guaranteed, but it would be a possibility in the event that an adversary attacked US nuclear command and control with conventional weapons. And so that's the scenario that worries me. And I should say this very briefly, this also could work in reverse as well. There are Russian dual-use assets, there are Chinese dual-use assets. This is not just a problem of Russian attacks against the US, it's also potentially a problem of US attacks against Russia or China too. Anyway, very much look forward to discussing this further.
James, thank you very much for this. I thought that was a very concise description of how this mesh of capabilities, doctrines, and perceptions thereof can affect in this particular scenario. Christine, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for Wilfred and John and the Unideer team for having me. I believe Letitia has slides that she may push along with my remarks. If not, that's okay. So it's hard to narrow down to one escalation scenario that is most worrisome for our prompt today, but this week it's North Korea. So I'm going to paint the picture of a scene starting over the last 5 years or so with the conditions that build up to what could be an escalation scenario with North Korea in the United States. As has been mentioned so far, the norms against weapons of mass destruction are under increasing strain and breaking down. Over the course of several years, several countries, including North Korea, use chemical weapons. North Korea is also testing more advanced missile capabilities that are capable of delivering nuclear warheads. Arms control treaties are increasingly under strain and being scrapped. There are dangerous trends in deterrence concepts and the types of nuclear weapons capabilities that many countries are investing in particular toward those weapons that are considered more usable, as Wilfred mentioned in his open remarks, and in an otherwise conventional conflict. A now declassified US CIA memo from the year 2000 commented about Russia's nuclear forces and its low yield nuclear capabilities in particular that, quote, they lower the threshold for first use of nuclear weapons and blur the boundary between nuclear and conventional warfare, unquote. Yet just over a decade later, the United States, as well as other countries, appear to be pivoting back toward these very capabilities and ideas. In fact, defense officials in many countries now openly speak about the importance of integrating conventional and nuclear approaches to deterrence and quote unquote limited nuclear options for restoring deterrence. Some US nuclear experts begin openly discussing the possibilities and advantages of nuclear strikes that they claim will produce only low casualty rates. Those scenarios very often specifically mention North Korea, which does not go unheard there. It's increasingly unclear to many countries under what conditions the United States or Russia would actually use nuclear weapons. It is clear that they are both expanding their arsenals in ways that appear to broaden those scenarios in which nuclear weapons might be used. These include altering several otherwise conventional systems to also carry nuclear warheads, knowing that in conflict, other countries will not know if what is being deployed or launched, whether they are conventional or nuclear. Meanwhile, North Korea continues expanding its capabilities of its missile forces and both showing them off in parades, as we saw in recent days, and conducting more test flights. Looking ahead on what I would call the ramp up toward conflict around the years 2020 to 2025, there are further stalled attempts at diplomacy with North Korea, attempts at further arms control agreements among Russia, the United States, China, and others also stall. The US accelerates its plan to bring back nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missiles, which it had abandoned in previous decades. stating that it plans to deploy them now no later than 2025. Over the first half of the decade, the United States moves additional ground, air, and naval forces and assets into South Korea and the Northwestern Pacific Ocean. Those are relatively paced movements meant to augment defensive strength and hopefully encourage diplomacy. But of course, North Korea reads them as offensive capability buildups. North Korea itself is increasing its pace of missile launches all into the waters around South Korea and Japan, conducting 30 launches in the year 2024 alone. By early 2025, the United States states that it is deploying the new nuclear sea-launched cruise missile to enhance deterrence in Europe and Asia, but it does not specify whether this includes areas that are in the range of North Korea. In North Korea, Kim orders new nuclear tests, knowing that they'll be detected by international monitors. In this future scenario, several conditions that we see common in conflicts are present. Both sides are conducting cyber attacks in the years leading up to this, further blurring an already muddy information environment. Disinformation abounds from many countries. Both sides have inadequate intelligence. Further intelligence within their countries may be manipulated or buried to suit political needs. Disconnects exist between perspectives in the capitals and in the field. Both countries, there's fear of providing advice that conflicts with political desires. And among nations involved, there's no hotline anymore for each nation's leaders to quickly reach each other, to send clear messages or to convey understanding that could help diffuse tensions and attacks. That summer, now in 2025, in this scenario, South Korean vessel moves close to North Korean waters. The North Korean side strikes it. It's unclear if this is ordered by Kim or a lower level military commander overreacting. The US and South Korea launch a limited strike to take out one North Korean mobile ICBM launcher site in response and hope that Kim will back down. The next night, the DPRK launches a limited rocket and artillery attack aimed north of Seoul. The US and South Korea respond with limited counterstrikes and movements of ROK forces to prepare for escalation. The US president issues a statement that the use of all weapons, including nuclear weapons, is on the table if North Korea does not cease. It's unclear to everybody if those comments were coordinated in advance with his political and military commanders. North Korea goes live on the air. Kim goes live on the air to remind the world that he can threaten US territory with his nuclear weapons. In the coming days, the excellent pathogen early warning detection systems in South Korea sound a new alarm. Busan has been attacked with anthrax. It was clearly not delivered by air. US and South Korean experts therefore deduce that DPRK Special Operations Forces must have infiltrated into the South, perhaps before conflict ensued. They have to suspect that other cells may be in the country and have biological weapons there. South Korean and US forces are all too aware that North Korea has chemical and biological weapons that could quickly kill millions. The US announces it will imminently carry out a conventional cruise missile strike in retaliation, and again warning Kim to back down before triggering a broader response. The US launches dozens of conventional Tomahawk cruise missiles from a nearby ship in an early nighttime strike. There's no way for North Korean leaders to know whether the attack underway includes one or more nuclear warheads. They believe that they're seeing decapitation strikes meant to take them out. They also know that US nuclear doctrine allows for nuclear attacks in response to the use of other weapons of mass destruction. There's almost no time to determine if they're under attack or not by a nuclear attack. Yet in some ways it doesn't matter. Even though it's early in the conflict, they're convinced that their only hope is to restore deterrence with a nuclear strike of their own. They therefore respond with a nuclear attack. The scenario that concerns me most this week.
Christine, thank you very much for painting that very vivid picture, and I appreciate kind of the steps that you outline at each stage of the process to get there. JD, over to you for your presentation.
Right. Thank you very much, Wilfried, and thanks to Unidir for the invitation to attend this panel. So what I will describe is a sort of a scenario involving cross-strait conflict, and which may lead to a US-China nuclear use. As we all know, in recent months, and clearly the cross-strait relations have become significantly deteriorated. And with growing US-Taiwan ties and also growing US-China strategic rivalry. The Chinese leadership may feel time is not on its side with regard to its fundamental goal of reunification. So in the coming sort of months or years, there might be a scenario where the mainland China may start to use non-peaceful means to bring Taiwan into the fold. And this is possible because over the last 2 decades, and especially since the 1995-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, the balance of military power has shifted to China's favor. In the regional military balance of power, also China has significantly enhanced its missile capabilities, its naval capabilities, and its air power capabilities. And over the last 40 years, with regard to Taiwan and the defense of Taiwan, the United States has pretty much practiced a strategic ambiguity with the purpose to sort of a dual deterrence against either side of the Taiwan Strait to deliberately change the status quo. And the US definitely against a forceful change of the status quo. So any scenario that the Chinese use of force against Taiwan will trigger certainly deliberation of US defense assistance, which Beijing will consider to be a likely scenario in order to deter or dissuade the US from intervening. In addition to the military actions against Taiwan, China may contemplate some limited attack or strike against US military assets in the Western Pacific to prevent or delay the US from intervention. Likewise, I think from the US perspective, it will take into consideration that this likely Chinese action. So on the US side, there are also incentives to prevent the Chinese from launching even a conventional strike against its asset. So one of the ways to do that would be to disable Chinese command, control, and any support facilities, infrastructures that would allow Chinese military to carry out conventional strike against US assets. But because of the weakness or the lack of sufficient early warning capabilities, and because the commingling of some of China's missile forces, batteries, and where those the missiles can be dual capable, and so attack on Chinese conventional missile facilities might incur inadvertent destruction of Chinese nuclear arsenal. So that may invite the Chinese to retaliate in kind. So the escalation during a period of intensified exchange from across strait and to whether the US will intervene and how China believes it can deter the US from an intervention may rapidly escalate into first conventional military exchange, and because the reason I just listed could result in a nuclear exchange. So there's a very high risk of nuclear escalation, even though official Chinese policy is no first use. But you can imagine, just like the US 20 2018 nuclear posture review that US is leaving everything on the table, despite the fact that Obama administration has indicated to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in US defense. If any other countries attack US critical infrastructure, then US would be willing to use nuclear retaliation. So this same logic would apply to, in China's case, given it has a very small nuclear arsenal and given that the US has both missile defense and a much stronger conventional capabilities. So China would be would be under significant pressure to escalate to a nuclear use if and when its own nuclear arsenal and missiles are being attacked, even by conventional, say, the global prompt conventional missile strikes. And so these risks cannot be precluded given the current situation where the United States, China have no direct, or certainly have a minimum direct nuclear dialogue and consultation. The few and far between official dialogues in around 2008, 2010, now no longer exist and cease to operate. So therefore, at this critical juncture where the both sides need to have a direct channel of communication, it is not there. So this is a particular concern as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you so much, JD. It strikes me among the three presentations that we're talking about three different geographic spheres in the world, and yet there are quite a lot of similarities, underlying similarities in terms of kind of the role of crisis, the integration or convergence of systems, misunderstandings or ambiguities, and so forth. But I'll leave that to John to pick apart some of those similarities and questions he might have. Before I turn it over to him, I did want to encourage all of you and the crowd to submit some questions to the Q&A. We'll be getting to that later in the session. But John Borey is the research coordinator at Unitier and the program lead for WMD OSW. And so I'll turn it over to him for his thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, Wilfred, and thank you to all of the panelists today for being willing to speak to us and to share some of their thinking about these. All three panelists have done a lot of work in different areas of scholarship which are relevant to nuclear risk reduction, and I'd encourage those of you who are participating today, if you're not familiar with their scholarship, then it's really worth seeking out. There's some really very good stuff there. I know that the next part of the discussion is going to get into, how to reduce or close some of these pathways, in doctrine, policy, or operational terms. So what I wanted to do now was really to ask a couple of questions to get the panelists to expand on one or two of the things that they've said, because they have spoken only briefly. And in that respect, I've got a couple of questions, one for James, one for Christine in particular, and then one for all of the panel, in fact, including JD. The first one for James is really, you kind of mentioned as an afterthought at the end of your presentation about escalation, that this entanglement could occur in sort of similar ways to the scenario that you outlined with respect to US attacks in the context of Russia or China. And so I just wondered if you would be prepared to sort of tell us a bit more about that, about what those possible scenarios might look like. And for you, Christine, I thought that it was very interesting, the sort of detailed kind of pathway scenario that you outlined with respect to the DPRK and in the US in a crisis. one of our contributors to the Closing Pathways publication, Tanya Ogilvie-White, in fact, in her chapter on the DPRK, in her view, she reached the conclusion that one of the riskiest scenarios is the possibility of a US first strike, whether with conventional or nuclear capabilities to preempt the DPRK's first strike nuclear and missile capabilities. So I sort of wonder what you think of that in terms of, you know, your thinking about this and what you've seen. How likely is that? Is that a plausible sort of thing? And then the third question I had is for all of the panelists, whoever wants to sort of take this on, and maybe you have different views on it. So in the work that Wilfred and others have done at Unidir, sort of talked about sort of four broad categories of pathway toward nuclear use, and that is doctrinal, escalatory, unauthorized, and accidental. And really, all of your scenarios today have revolved around the more or less sort of escalatory pathway. And I think, you know, that's very important in terms of an indication to us in the audience that, you know, this is something we should be concerned about in the current environment. But I'm sort of also interested in your views with respect to at least one of the other pathways, because you know, something that we've seen is, although there's a lot of discussion about nuclear risk reduction at the moment and possible measures, there are different understandings of what that means. And for example, the Western nuclear weapon states like to talk about strategic risk reduction, which a lot of it revolves around clarifying doctrine and transparency measures and other important things, but not so much about the possibility of accidental use. Or some kind of contingent scenario that would result in a failure, for example, in nuclear command control intelligence systems with similar consequences. But we can see from the historical record, and anyone who's read Eric Schloss's book, for example, Command and Control, will see that there's been a disturbing pattern of incidents and accidents involving nuclear weapons and their delivery systems since they were invented. And scholars like Charles Perrow and Scott Sagan have used normal accident theory to show that we should expect problems with any hazardous technology in a complex, tightly coupled system. So how sanguine should we be about accidents involving nuclear weapons? Are they a pathway to use we should be concerned about in the panel's view, or should we just not worry? We should just focus on these sort of escalatory pathways. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, John. At this point, I'll just throw it right back to the panel for their thoughts on any or all of what John has posed. So perhaps we'll start with James.
Thanks, Wilfred. Thanks, John, and thanks to all the other panelists. John asked me to briefly explain how this could work the other way, that is to say, how US attacks against Russia or China could spark escalation. And I think the key there is to realize that both Russia and China have deep and abiding concerns about the survivability of their nuclear forces. That's to say, you know, they're worried that the US would have the capability in a deep crisis or a conflict to eliminate their nuclear forces preemptively. And there's certain actions the US could plausibly take that could exacerbate that fear. So Russia, for example, is ringed by early warning radars. And the primary purpose of these radars is to detect an incoming US nuclear strike so that Russia could launch its nuclear forces before they were eliminated. But these radars also track satellites. So, you know, again, if you're in a conventional conflict, imagine that Russia is attacking US satellites in low Earth orbit. And this is just like, you know, to try to undermine the US conventional war effort. One way the US could try to defend its satellites is to attack Russia's early warning radar, because if Russia can't see where US satellites are, it can't attack them. But that, from a Russian perspective, would look like preparations for a US strike on its nuclear forces. So that's a kind of entanglement scenario involving Russia. With China, very briefly, you know, China has these over-the-horizon radars, which would be used to locate US aircraft carriers and other large ships. But they will also be China's best means of detecting incoming stealthy US aircraft that could pose a threat to China's nuclear forces. So again, you could imagine the US attacking these radars, so China didn't know where US ships were, but raising concerns about China, about the survivability of China's nuclear forces. And as with all of these pathways, the more that happens at a single time, the more dangerous this becomes. I mean, one can argue over whether any individual attack is or isn't likely to precipitate escalation. What tends to be more important, I think, is perhaps the combination of events coincided. JD gave you a number of other examples of entanglement amongst China's nuclear and conventional forces. Super briefly, in answer to John's question, I think the likelihood of these accidental pathways are really difficult to assess, which is kind of a non-answer in some ways, and I certainly don't want to hog the conversation here, but just to say that it's very, very hard to determine whether these are kind of low probability events or super low probability events. And your answer to that probably depends how likely these are to compare to other escalation pathways, and whether these could plausibly escalate into something like an all-out nuclear war, as opposed to more limited use, is kind of, I think, that calculation affects where you want to put your resources in terms of which pathway to escalate and which pathways to try to address. And I can't prove this, but my sense is that some of these inadvertent pathways have higher risk than these accidental pathways.
Thank you, James. I think your answer also speaks to how much unknown information is still out there about, certainly about weapons programs and so forth. Christine, any thoughts on John's comments?
Yeah, absolutely. So I certainly agree with the author of your last study that there's increasing risk of US preemptive first strike with a nuclear weapon, that risk is rising. We have officials who openly speak about certain investments in our current US modernization program being designed for it to be more politically acceptable to actually conduct a first strike in that manner. The scenario that I laid out, though, is actually what I would call the lead up to preemption, and a nuclear first strike coming from North Korea, basically due to a miscalculation because the US seems to be pivoting toward more capabilities and potentially doctrine that lead up into this preemptive situation. So if the United States is going to go in that preemptive direction, including with a nuclear first strike, there will be other things that they will do first to try to get him to back down. And that's what I tried to outline, is that even if the United States is, and in conjunction with South Korea and obviously Japan, even if the United States is taking a relatively measured approach to try to get hostilities to decrease again, all of those actions will also increase the odds of a first strike coming from the north as well. So we need to be cautious of that. So don't disagree. I wouldn't say which one of these things is more likely. The concern is that we're leading to a situation that both of these things are more likely because of the capabilities and doctrinal changes that have occurred in all of our countries in recent years and that appear to be continuing on that trend. In terms of accidents, so wearing my former DoD hat from the Pentagon, I can say that there is significant work that goes into avoiding accidents, obviously. That doesn't mean that they don't happen. It doesn't mean that they're not possible, of course. But I think that there's, I'm happy to know personally that there's a lot of work that goes into trying to reduce the odds of that. What I worry about on the accidental side is that at least sort of from a US perspective, there's increasing focus on things like how to reduce accidents, but I think that it's a way of potentially deferring bolder action and reducing the odds of miscalculation and inadvertent use that are coming from our own changes in declaratory policy and the increasing range of capabilities that are being introduced by our current nuclear modernization program. So whereas it's important to focus on that, real risk reduction, significant risk reduction is going to come more from changing the sort of shape and how we perceive the use and the utility of nuclear weapons in our security strategy, more from those extra little measures that might help reduce the cause of accidents. So in terms of a response side, I would personally prefer that our policies focus much more on reducing the risk of actual use of nuclear weapons. while we continue to try and maintain high standards to reduce the risk of accidents as well.
Thanks for that perspective, Christine. JD, any thoughts from your side?
Yes, thanks, John. I mean, for the general question, your question about only escalatory pathway, but not the doctrinal and the other, I mean, three accidental and unauthorized. I see, I mean, certainly within China over the last few years, have been quite some debates about whether China should modify its no first use doctrine and to make it more ambiguous. And even some military analysts talk about adopting such a posture as launch on warning, launch under attack. And so certainly the changing environment which China faces with a small nuclear arsenal, although growing at comparatively, relatively faster pace vis-a-vis other established nuclear power, still is very small, over 300 nuclear warheads. And given the US missile defense capabilities, and given the US conventional strike capabilities, and the network of US allies, because there are now also discussion, you know, like people like Tong Zhao, you know, James' colleague at Carnegie, talking about, you know, China is increasingly also concerned with US allies' missile defense capabilities. You have layers of missile defense network, which pose significant threat to China's relatively small nuclear arsenal. Now, related to this pressure on doctrinal change is the potential for accidental launch, not so much in the you know, because of the technical failure that may exist, but it's because of the lack of a sophisticated and well-developed early warning system, and the ability to differentiate. Again, I refer to James' the work on, you know, is it a nuke? I mean, given now increasingly we have this dual capable long-range strike deliver systems, and how would the Chinese early warning system detect and differentiate? And given if there's a large number of strike incoming, and then obviously there will be a pressure whether, you know, China should start launching nuclear missiles because they may be co-mingle on the same missile size, so they face the prospect of being completely destroyed, you know, neutralized. And so there will be pressure. So, but that accidental launch or use or pathway is more about the lack of confidence, the ability to accurately identify, understand, and know, and the ability to differentiate, which will be, you know, between conventional nuclear missiles and conventional and the nuclear missiles. And so that may lead to the nuclear use accidentally, but in a different sense, if you know what I mean.
Thank you, JD. I think your answer also gets to kind of some of the blurriness of these pathways, right? Even though we're talking about escalatory scenarios, we're also bringing in doctrinal factors, the risk of accidents, and so forth. Before we get to the audience submissions, and I see that we have a ton of questions, I do have a couple of rounds of questions for the panel from my side, but maybe I'll just kind of combine those into one big round, and we can jump to the audience questions right after that. So my first question kind of is directed at each of you individually, but here I'd also encourage you to engage what you're interested in and engage each other's presentations and answers as well. But let's start with James. So today, I think your scenario that you've talked about was primarily kind of about space assets, but you've also written about kind of cyber, the role of conventional, which also came up. And I was just wondering if there's a domain in which you think the risk of entanglement is especially acute, and can you discuss why this is the case? For Christine, you spoke about kind of the destabilizing effects of the spread and development of certain capabilities, including conventional. And I wanted to push you a little bit more on maybe the intangible kind of indirect risk factors. Your PowerPoint slide, for instance, talked about political pressure, and this kind of gets to the point about perceived usability and even the role of rhetoric and things like this. Can you talk about how these might feed into this escalation scenario? And for JD, for across nuclear armed states, there can appear different notions of nuclear deterrence, right? How it's conceived and practiced. How do these, as well as the associated ambiguities and opacities, impacts the possibility that deterrence can fail? And before I throw it to you, I'll also ask each of you to respond to kind of the second round of questions, but this is much simpler, which is what can be done to reduce the possibility of these scenarios? Where do we start? How do you begin nuclear risk reduction? So I know I'm throwing quite a bit out there. Pick and choose what you'd like to respond to. James, back to you.
Thanks, Wilfred. I think cyber capabilities have the potential to be uniquely escalatory for the following reason. In theory, they could threaten exactly the same kind of dual-use assets that anti-space weapons could, or that high-precision conventional weapons could. But you have this potentially extra layer of ambiguity, which is the challenge of distinguishing between cyber espionage and cyber attack. So, if a state finds malign, malicious code in a dual-use command and control system, if it's complex code, it could take an awfully long time for it to determine the purpose of the code. And so, there's a risk that something that was purely intended to be espionage could be mistaken for an attack. And so I think you get that extra layer of ambiguity with cyber capabilities. And in terms of what could be done, I would highlight, just to staying within the cyber domain here, I think a challenging but an interesting idea, I think, would be for nuclear armed states to explore the possibility of a norm that they wouldn't conduct cyber interference operations of any kind with one another's nuclear command and control systems. Now, there's like 10 good reasons I can rattle off why that's a really hard thing to do, and I don't, I want to give up. I don't want to hold the conversation, so I don't want to run through that right now. Suffice to say, I think one shouldn't be naive about whether this is easy, but given the scale of the risks here, I think that's the kind of direction that states at least ought to be discussing feasibility in.
Thanks for that, James. Christine, any thoughts?
Sure, and I would echo that. None of this is easy in terms of addressing these challenges, but it's exactly the right time to do the hardest things, which I think is important. Wilfred, agree with your comment on the indirect effects, the rhetorical, et cetera. So this is where I pulled in some specific elements of things. The president's declaration in my scenario that the US could use nuclear weapons is actually from Truman in 1950, based on his declaration when the Chinese entered North Korea to push the UN forces back across the line into the South. So it sounds like our current president perhaps, but actually echoes history. And that's one of the biggest things in this in terms of the rhetoric that's used in the perceptions, is that there's so much discussion of use of nuclear weapons in these escalation scenarios as if something will happen and then we know exactly what's going to happen in response, and that there's a controllability to escalation. That's simply not true. Those discussions and thinking about nuclear weapons that way deliberately leaves out the general fog of war that we see over and over and over again. This is part of why I made sure to include some of those things: intelligence failures and manipulations, leaders not being told the truth about conditions on the ground. That's common in almost every conflict across the last, more than the last century. And we need to understand that those conditions are going to prevail in a situation where nuclear weapons must be used as well. We need to remember that history. And to your point, I deliberately included the US making a statement that the strikes that it was going to conduct were conventional only, but that the North Koreans responded with nuclear weapons anyway because they simply didn't believe that if the US has a chance of slipping in a nuclear warhead into a launcher along with the other conventional only Tomahawk missiles in this particular scenario, there's no way for that leader to know. And if there's zero trust that your adversary is going to be telling the truth, even if they try to signal that they are not escalating to nuclear warfare, there can still be confusion that enters in that scenario. So definitely agree that that's a huge problem. Goes back to anything that can be done to restore some trust and feeling of credibility among nations in the coming years would be really, really important for not preventing that type of miscalculation, but certainly reducing the odds of it even by a little bit would be helpful. And then in terms of what could be done, again, I think we go for the hard here. I saw some questions about no first use policy and things like that. I think that there are a lot of no harm things that can be introduced like that. But frankly, on that, I don't think that countries believe each other, that they would or wouldn't use nuclear weapons first in certain scenarios. So that perception of the other has to come into play. And I think it makes declaratory policies like that, frankly, a little bit less useful. Countries are looking at the capabilities of all other countries. And so I think we need to go back to, again, how do we take out the specific nuclear capabilities that are most likely to lead to some of these confusions in the event of conflict and miscalculations, including some of the scenarios that James and JD described.
Thank you for that, Christine. The last part of your answer does make me wonder what the potential expiration of New START could mean for these scenarios. And I know James is doing some work on that, and perhaps I can ask all of you to speak as to that a little bit later. JD, your thoughts?
Yes, I think all nuclear weapon states, of course, have their own perceptions and notions of deterrence. And certainly for China is to protect the country against nuclear attack and even nuclear coercion. And so therefore, it's not part of the sort of general warfighting doctrine and structure. But for the United States, in addition to deterrence, which I think China and the United States would share the same perception of deterrence and notion of deterrence, which is to dissuade any opponent from engaging in certain course of actions where the cost overweight any benefits. But the U.S. has also extended deterrence, responsibilities where it even in the NPR's reference to, and always lump together any attack or nuclear attack or attack on nuclear infrastructure of the United States and its allies. And so the U.S. deterrence certainly is more expended than China's. And in terms of the pathways of addressing the nuclear risk, I think first thing, of course, would be to have a regular channel of communication and dialogue. I mean, even during the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union were engaged in extensive sort of arms control dialogue, and later on, and certainly in the 70s and late 60s, 70s in nuclear limitation negotiation. But there's no such structure, certainly a well-established structure between China and the United States. When I look at the US and China directly, I mean, neither country would have a deliberate policy of first nuclear use against the other country. But the risk still exists because of the third party scenarios and involvement. And increasingly, of course, as we discussed earlier, the entanglement of, with the development of new technologies, with the commingling of dual capable delivery systems. And so all of these become quite blurred. And this requires, and certainly direct dialogue between key nuclear weapon states, and definitely and today between the United States and China, and between the United States and Russia.
Thank you, JD. I think your answer also gets to Christine's point about the need to rebuild trust and confidence. We have about 15, 20 minutes left, and I want to turn to the audience Q&A at this point. There are quite a number of questions, so I think I'm just going to select 3 at a time from the ones that have gotten the most thumbs up to begin with. The first question from Betty Su reads, the scenarios described are all illustrating pretty linear, narrow pathways involving 2 or 3 states. What additional actors, actions, or technologies are likely to get into the picture and complicate these pathways? And maybe if I can add to that question, which is from a risk reduction perspective, a lot of the work that has been done has been primarily at the bilateral level. And I just wonder, does kind of the inclusion of multiple actors complicate or risk reduction efforts? A second question from Darius Mesner at UNODA is, are you especially concerned about scenarios involving large-scale nuclear attacks? And in some ways, I think that gets back to John's comments about, we're focusing primarily on escalatory scenarios, but is this kind of larger scale attack a concern? And then the third question comes from my colleague Pavel Podvik, and he directs this at James in particular, but he writes that it's possible that entanglement is a deliberate choice. He just appreciate your thoughts on this, and James, you can read what he's inputted there. But I'll stop with those 3 questions, and again, the panelists can pick and choose what they'd like to respond to. James, back to you.
Thanks, Wilfred. I'll stick to Pavel's question because that was specifically directed at me. There are many government officials and experts within the US who believe that the entanglement between China's nuclear and conventional forces is quite deliberate. And the argument is there that China attempts to deter the United States from attacking Chinese conventional forces by raising the risk that if it does so, nuclear war will result. I asked my colleagues Tong Zhao and Li Bin to look at this question when we published a Carnegie report about 3 years ago now, which is called Entanglement, Nuclear Technologies and Non-Nuclear Risks. They looked back at this and they conclude they were pretty convinced at the end of the day that China has not deliberately entangled its nuclear and non-nuclear forces. And I think that was significant because when they started off, they said, well, we'll look at this question, but I really don't think we'll be able to reach a conclusion. And I told them, fine. I think if you can't reach a conclusion about whether entanglement was deliberate in the Chinese case, that's okay. Like, I think that's a useful thing to say. And slightly to my surprise, they came back and they actually said, they did reach a fairly firm conclusion that they believe that China's decision to entangle its nuclear and non-nuclear forces was not deliberate. However, they said, now that entanglement has happened, there are at least some Chinese experts who are aware of its potential advantages. And so it may prove difficult to disentangle China's nuclear forces because it may view that now as being kind of useful, even if it didn't deliberately entangle them in the first place. In that same volume, my colleagues, Alexei Arbatov, Vladimir Dorkin, and Peter Tipichkanov said that, again, the entanglement in Russia's case was not deliberate. It was a cost-saving thing. You know, you're obviously one of the world's great experts on Russia's nuclear forces, so I'm very interested in whether you agree with that assessment. And as far as the US goes, again, you know, my belief is that the entanglement within the US has been kind of an inadvertent thing. It's partly cost, it's partly you develop something for nuclear purposes that turns out to be really good for conventional purposes as well. You know, again, I don't think this was a deliberate strategy in the US case.
Thank you, James. Christine, any thoughts?
Sure. So I'll take a bit of the first two questions. So am I worried about large-scale nuclear attack? Absolutely. But I take it face value, countries like ours that are deliberately pushing more in the direction of quote unquote low yield options and some of these specific capabilities that are in the design phase or entering into our deployments now. I take it face value when people say that the goal is for them to be more usable. So, you know, in terms of what pathways to use we should be most worried about, I am most worried that those types of weapons put us at the greatest risk there. Obviously, there's still a concern about the large-scale catastrophe, but I see that most likely coming as a chain of escalation after an initial launch by lower yield nuclear weapons or a smaller number of nuclear weapons at the outset. And maybe having a larger sort of buildup as the escalation fails to be controlled after that. In terms of additional actors and technologies, yes, absolutely, it makes things more complicated, but I don't think that we should be worried that it's beyond our realm to deal with. So humans have created these complicated and intertwined systems, and it's within our power to untangle some of these things and to knock back the risk on them. In terms of risk reduction, I think it's actually much more helpful to move into more multilateralism. It definitely brings in more interests, but again, those interests are all within our human capacity to understand and comprehend with one another. I think we should be looking much more at some of the UNIDIR work that has gone on, multilateral concepts for verification of different arms control measures. As we get into a post-bilateral paradigm for arms control, there are going to be cases where the countries that may agree to certain nuclear risk reduction measures also don't trust each other to be the verifiers. And here are other countries that potentially are not allied to and don't possess nuclear weapons of their own might play a really unique role in some of these agreements. I also think that we're moving in a direction where we need to think harder about political agreements that precede legal agreements to limit or control or to reduce certain nuclear weapons or risks. Those political agreements, if they're signed on to by non-nuclear weapon states, for example, similar to the way the zones, nuclear-free weapon zones in the world have political backing by so many countries, I think that actually really helps to create norms and solidify them in the risk reduction measure.
Thanks so much, Christine. JD?
Yes, I think I would just maybe follow on with multilateralizing the nuclear risk reduction, so move beyond bilateral. So in that context, I think China could be receptive to a trilateral sort of a nuclear dialogue without committing itself to legally binding agreement or whatever the document. I think there are a number of benefits to it. Number one, you would make the US aware that a purely bilateral understanding of a US-China nuclear dynamic could be misleading because each side considered its own action as purely defensive. And China definitely needs to have a assured and survival nuclear arsenal where the US see any growth of or growing capability, mobility of Chinese nuclear forces as a factor that could undermine the US ability for damage limitation or, basically weaken its own, the credibility, its commitment to its allies, extended nuclear deterrence. So in a trilateral kind of a context, China can lay down its concerns and all three parties can lay down the concerns and exchange and to move the narrowly bilateral lens to basically to help all of them to understand the complexities of nuclear risk reduction. So that would be a very useful experience for China, not to mention that sitting at the same table as with the US and Russia would in a way elevate China's status. And certainly the US and Russia and then previously the Soviet Union have a lot to offer in terms of negotiations, verifications, and all the tips and experience of nearly 50 years. So it wouldn't be bad for China to learn from these experiences without committing itself to any binding commitment obligations, because it is, after all, only about 20% of the other nuclear powers deployed capability.
Thank you, JD. It does underline, I think there is a history of risk reduction measures that can be drawn on for inspiration. Turning back to the next set of questions for the panelists, the first is from Patrick, which is what escalation control method could the US, China, Russia, or DPRK pursue that would provide the greatest impact? And maybe to build on that question, I think there's a lot of new research about how traditional notions of escalation ladders don't necessarily or accurately reflect the current situation. Rebecca Hersman has written about escalation wormholes, for instance. And so then I would add on to that, what does this mean for how we think about escalation management? A second question is from our good friend, colleague, Siko Vandermeer from Klingendale. What low-hanging fruits are there that the speakers see with regard to reducing nuclear risk? What is easy to accomplish? And perhaps, again, I'll add on and say, also in the context of this NPT review cycle and what should be the focus at the review conference. The third question comes from Torif Pius from Germany, and I think there was some discussion about this earlier, but how could a possible no first use posture, and he specifies from the US, affect future escalation? And that's something, at least under the Obama administration, that I think they had considered at one point in time. So any of those questions, back to you, James.
Thanks, Wilfred. Let me take Patrick and Siko's question together. I believe the easiest and the thing to do and the thing that could be implemented fastest is unilateral changes to the way that states go about war planning, which is kind of a depressing topic. And focusing on a unilateral step doesn't imply that I think the cooperative stuff isn't important. I think the cooperative stuff is extremely important, but it's harder. And relations between the US and Russia and the US and China are such that it's pretty difficult to imagine them taking cooperative steps in the short term as much as they should and as much as it would be beneficial for them to do so. But in terms of, one of the things that worries me at the moment is that the people responsible for war planning don't think about escalation very much. And so when the possibility of, say, the United States attacking Russian early warning radars gets, planned for, or, Russian or Chinese attacks against US early warning satellites, the military officers and their commanders who are thinking about the value of this in a kind of tactical sense are not necessarily aware of the potential escalatory and strategic consequences. And, the senior decision makers, civilian or military, are not being told, look, this is a good way to protect our satellite, but, there is a risk that this could escalate into nuclear war. Those trade-offs are not being presented. Now, I can't prove this. All of this happens in a very classified behind the scenes way. But, on scant data points, it worries me that there is not this kind of deep thinking. So, within the US, one thing I've called for is for a very senior civilian official, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, to be legally assigned the responsibility of assessing war plans for their escalatory consequences. You know, and that doesn't mean that you don't plan to do escalatory stuff. It means you understand the risks and you present senior people with those risks so they understand the risks they're running and can judge whether the benefits outweigh those risks. And, you know, to my mind, it would be helpful to have a similar kind of structure in the Russian and the Chinese context. Now, I don't know who the right official is. You know, I wouldn't presume to just assume that this idea that, you know, may or may not work well in the US context would work well in the Russian and Chinese context. But this basic idea that, you know, states should, the people responsible for war planning should be forced to think about escalation risks. That's a relatively low-hanging fruit, I think, in some ways.
Thank you for that. Christine?
Yeah, thanks. I like the idea of bold unilateral moves that can just, even if they're small, we should not hang up reducing risk in smart ways for our countries based on what other countries do. There are some clear unilateral moves that make sense in the coming years if somebody has the political will to do so. So I'll weave a couple of the questions together as well. I'm actually, one of my concerns that I think about is actually too much focus on low-hanging fruit. And then both time and political capital are wasted on easy steps that also don't reduce risk significantly enough. So we'll do a plug. We have an article in War on the Rocks today about some specific ideas on this. I think we should actually go for some of the stuff that's a little bit potentially harder to get by, but that would reduce risk in a much more serious way. On the no first use question, again, I think it's a no harm policy, but I don't actually think it matters that much. Russia has specific weapons that, you know, they flaunt. They say that that they're for retaliation purposes, and we don't believe them. We say the same things about some of our weapons and the scenarios for use for them, and they don't believe us. There's so much distrust, as I said, between these countries that even if you have a no first use declaratory policy, the credibility and trust among countries that that's actually going to hold in the case of conflict, no matter how that conflict is going, I think is just not that credible among countries. So again, there's no harm necessarily, but I don't think our countries should waste a lot of political capital on declaratory policies that don't move the needle. I think we need to target the systems and investments and doctrine. One of the common themes from JD and James and in mine is all the ambiguity. Take those systems and capabilities and the way that we talk about those systems, find all of the ways that they introduce more confusion, more ambiguity, more guessing and misunderstanding between our countries, and start unwinding those investments. There are weapons that we don't need among all of our countries that we could take off the table that would reduce ambiguity and therefore dial back some of these risks of miscalculation, of escalation, including an inadvertent escalation, and potentially build more trust among our countries than is the case. If we say, you know, we're building and building and building and expanding our nuclear capability sets, but telling countries, don't worry, we're not going to use them first on you. We need to start unwinding those investments first and focus on those modernization programs that don't make a lot of sense, but that introduce more confusion into the system. So I think we should go for the hard in some ways, even though that's not low-hanging fruit, it's worthwhile.
Thanks for that, Christine. JD, any quick thoughts?
Yes, I would follow Christian's comments by, basically going to a fundamental question, that is, what is to be achieved, for nuclear use? You can talk about survival or vital interests, but at the end of the day, you can imagine a nuclear escalation to a big nuclear exchange with millions of people killed, all the destruction, and then what can be achieved through the such nuclear exchange. So I just think there's a disjoint between the objectives, national security, sovereignty, core interests, and then the means. I think it's just quite disproportionate in whatever way you talk about them, right? So that's one. I think it's to go to the fundamental. The key question is what are to be achieved through the use of nuclear weapons. And second, I think in addition to, I mean, of course, NFU is not credible in the sense of countries can change their policies and doctrines when they feel the need to do so. But I think a way to prolong the use of nuclear weapons to avoid all the other problems and authorize accidental use would be, something like the alert just gave, instead of within 30 minutes or 15 minutes, you can punch the code, get the communication and preparation and launch, to put it longer, just so that countries have time to clarify situation rather than facing the pressure of doing something in an imminent fashion. So I think the alert, although it has received a lot of criticism during the past decade, when it was being discussed, I think it still has its values. That is, if we can delay the use, if we can think of more about means and ends, and these would maybe offer some serious consideration to the risk reduction.
Thank you, JD. I'm aware we are rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to ask our panelists if they want to speak really quickly for kind of a last take-home message, maybe 30 seconds or less, and we'll just go in the same order with John last. Take it away.
You put me on the spot there, Wilfred, and I didn't. I was thinking about some of the other about the answers to some of the other questions. So no, I won't leave you with a closing message. Just to say, thank you to Unidir for putting this together. Thank you to my fellow panelists, and thank you to the excellent questions.
I would just echo that. Thanks. Gratitude most of all, including for Unidir's continual, just incredible work across the field. One of my big takeaways is that there are so many things that we can do. And the more we all talk about the possibilities that are out there, the more they'll become politically feasible when the time is right for political leaders to actually want to take some of these risk reduction measures. So thank you for having us and for the continued good work. And I hope we all keep up these dialogues.
Yeah, likewise, I would like to thank Unidir for this opportunity to be part of this panel and for the conversation. My takeaway would be, yes, the current political environment is not very conducive, but at the technical level, and there are experiences, a lesson to be learned and shared, I think we need to keep this a community of nuclear arms control experts, and then to educate the next generation of young people to engage in nuclear arms control disarmament.
Well, I guess I'm the lucky last. I'd like to thank all the panelists today. I think it's been absolutely superb. It's been so interesting. And it's really struck me, on the one hand, it's quite depressing when you think about where we are now and as compared to where we were with the optimism we had at the end of the 1990s with respect to the continued role of nuclear weapons. We thought it was diminishing. And unfortunately, we're not in that world right now. But I think that a couple of things come out very clearly from what the panelists have said today, and that's that we should be, relatively speaking, we should be concerned about a couple of these pathways that Wilfred's identified in his work, and others have too, about this possibility for escalation and crisis, whether it's inadvertent or whether it's deliberate, and the linkage there to the doctrinal pathway. So these are two things that perhaps delegates to the NPT might want to take away and to think about in terms of the kinds of ideas and proposals they might have on risk reduction in that context, which of course includes some of the nuclear weapon states, but not all of the nuclear armed states. And we'll need concentric circles. We'll need different sort of ways of approaching this that capture different audiences. I thought it was really interesting, the sort of interplay. I think especially James and Christine were talking about this sort of this conundrum of capabilities versus sort of declaratory measures. And I think subsequently Christine sort of clarified that a bit, and some, I think, very positive remarks and underline the need that we need kind of different sorts of approaches, probably at the same time, on risk reduction. And I just sort of throw out there that, you know, we saw during the Cold War that, you know, arms control, in addition to sort of trying to regulate capabilities, was also about clarifying understandings, and it was about regulating behavior. And I think that there's lots of scope for measures, some of which were mentioned by the panelists today, but they could include better crisis communication, and they could include appropriate norms of behavior in domains that during the Cold War included agreements, for example, to how to deal with crises in domains like the maritime domain or in the air. But I think especially from what James has said today, we really need this in the cyber domain, in the space domain, and from what Christina said, you know, in the context of new missile developments. And I think JD also underlined that in his Taiwan Strait sort of example. We need these sort of measures because of, you know, this potential for entanglement and its uncertain effects. And that just sort of comes to my final thought, which is, you know, escalation ladders have been mentioned a few times today. And I think that what's really needed is to look at some of these concepts and terms which were developed in past times and to ask critically, are they still really useful? Are they fit for purpose? And something that struck me from a recent Unity roundtable we had with some experts on nuclear deterrence and disarmament issues was that despite there being a parsimony to nuclear deterrence logic, it was also very clear that experts from different parts of the world had very different understandings of some of those terms and concepts related to deterrence and to arms control. So there's some work to be done. Are we living with nuclear escalation ladders, or is it more like a nuclear escalation jungle gym where you don't just go up and down, but you can go across and in and out, and there might be you know, several actors on the jungle gym at once? I don't know, but I think that our panelists today have introduced some really, really interesting questions. I hope that you'll explore their work. You can find references, I think, to all of our authors in some of the publications that you see here on the screen. And with that, I will hand it back to Wilfred.
Thanks, John. Apologies for not getting to all of the questions. I see there are quite a bit. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in this topic. Please take 30 seconds to complete the survey for this event that will also circulate by email, but it's in the chat. I did want to say, I think when we're focusing on these scenarios today, our intent is not to fearmonger, but rather to highlight how precisely the risk of nuclear weapon use can manifest and how different pathways to use can bear out. And it really, I think, underlines the importance of using of risk framing. You know, in order to have risk reduction, you have to have proper risk assessment and risk analysis. Unitier is going to continue its work on the topic, so please stay tuned. We'll issue a few more policy briefs before the end of the year. We'll delve into some of these scenarios and others. If you're interested, please get in touch. Just a final word of thank you to all of our panelists, to John for his commentating, to Letitia and the Unitier team for producing the event, and to all of you for joining and continuing to support and engage our work. So have a good afternoon from Geneva and wherever you might be. Take care.